Richard Kensington was not a man easily swayed by emotion. A self-made billionaire, he had built his empire from the ground up, every penny earned through unwavering determination, sharp foresight, and relentless ambition. His name commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. His business decisions were precise and calculated, earning him both admiration and fear. Yet none of that truly mattered to Richard. What he cherished most in the world was his son, Dorian. From the moment Dorian was born, he became Richard's pride and joy. Richard poured his heart into ensuring his son had the best of everything: elite education, exceptional mentors, and countless opportunities. He didn't amass his empire for personal glory alone. It was all for Dorian, with the hope that one day his son would take the reins and carry on his legacy. Dorian was the center of Richard's universe. But as the years went by, Richard watched in dismay as his son drifted further away. The love and devotion Richard lavished upon him were met with indifference. The once humble and appreciative young man had become unrecognizable, arrogant, entitled, and dismissive of values like loyalty. Integrity and hard work were values Dorian no longer seemed to embody. He took his father's wealth and influence for granted, leaving Richard struggling to recognize the son he had once cherished. The change in Dorian troubled him deeply. One evening, as Richard sat alone in his study staring out the window, a chilling thought gripped him. Had he failed as a father? Perhaps the very wealth he had worked so hard to build had corrupted his son. The idea gnawed at him, and Richard knew he had to uncover the truth. But words alone wouldn't suffice. To truly understand his son's heart, he would need to test him through actions, not conversation. After much deliberation, Richard devised a bold plan. He would leave everything behind: his mansion, his fortune, his name. He would live as an ordinary man, disappearing into the background, to see if Dorian cared enough to seek him out. It was a drastic measure, but to Richard, there was no other way. The next morning, Richard packed a small duffel bag with only the bare essentials and a modest amount of cash. As he stepped out of the mansion, he paused for a final look at the life he had built. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of clarity. This was something he needed to do. For weeks, Richard wandered the streets, far removed from the world of luxury he once knew. His once immaculate suits became worn and threadbare, his polished shoes scuffed beyond recognition. He slept in shelters, ate what little he could afford, and faded into anonymity. No longer was he Richard Kensington, the billionaire businessman. He had become just another face in the crowd. Just another face in the crowd. Richard kept his distance as he observed Dorian. His son continued to live a life of luxury, driving expensive cars and dining at exclusive restaurants. Occasionally, Richard caught glimpses of him through the grand windows of high-end venues or overheard whispers of his exploits. It was clear that Dorian hadn't missed the wealth his father had provided. But did he miss him? Richard didn't know. One day, Richard stood outside a lavish restaurant where Dorian often dined with business executives. Hidden across the street, he watched as Dorian arrived, laughing and chatting with colleagues. Pain gripped Richard's chest, but he stayed out of sight. Summoning his courage, Richard eventually decided to step inside. The restaurant's elegant decor, crisp linens, and low murmur of sophisticated conversations were a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. At the hostess stand, he requested a seat. The hostess's eyes swept over his disheveled appearance with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm sorry, sir," she said curtly. "We don't have seating available for someone like you." Richard's stomach twisted. He had grown accustomed to such treatment, but hadn't yet learned to numb himself to the sting. Swallowing his pride, he tried again. "Please, it's been a long day." The hostess remained unmoved, her expression icy. Resigned, Richard turned to leave, but not before his eyes found Dorian. His son was seated at a nearby table, surrounded by colleagues, laughing and carefree. A pang of sadness struck Richard, cutting deeper than he had expected. Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped closer and called out, "Dorian." Dorian turned, his expression shifting from confusion to something colder. "Do I know you?" he asked sharply. Richard's heart sank. Steeling himself, he replied, "It's me, your father." Dorian's gaze swept over Richard's weathered face. Without a moment's hesitation, he said, "I don't have time for this. Leave." The cold dismissal shattered Richard. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, crushed by his son's indifference. The following days passed in a fog of heartbreak. Richard realized his son had not only failed his test, but had failed him as a person. Determined to act, he contacted his lawyer, Marcus, with a drastic decision. "Reduce Dorian's inheritance," Richard instructed, his voice firm. "Leave him enough to survive, but not to thrive." Marcus hesitated. "I've worked with you for years, Richard, but this is unprecedented." "It has to be done," Richard replied. Richard also hired a private investigator, Olivia, to uncover the truth about Dorian's activities. The findings were devastating. Dorian had engaged in shady deals, manipulated clients, and betrayed loyal colleagues. His son was not just selfish but unethical. Heartbroken, Richard knew he had to confront Dorian one final time. Summoning him to the mansion, he prepared for the difficult conversation. When Dorian arrived, his once confident swagger was gone, replaced by a visible unease. Richard motioned for him to sit at the long dining table. "You failed me," Richard began, his voice steady but laced with pain. "I gave you everything, and you've thrown it all away." Dorian's voice rose defensively. "I built my success. I worked hard." "No," Richard countered, his voice steady. "You were handed everything, and you betrayed not just me, but the values I raised you with." Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside were legal documents severing Dorian's access to the family fortune. Dorian's face paled as he read through them. "You can't do this," Dorian shouted. "I already have," Richard replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is the last lesson I'll ever teach you. Build your own life from here." Enraged, Dorian stormed out of the mansion, vowing never to return. In the months that followed, Dorian's life unraveled. His business ventures collapsed, and the friends who had once surrounded him disappeared. For the first time, he was forced to face the consequences of his actions, alone. One rainy night, Dorian found himself standing outside the gates of the mansion he once called home. Soaked to the bone, he reflected on all he had lost. The wealth and luxury that once defined his life no longer mattered. What he missed most was his father's love and guidance. In that moment, Dorian realized the truth he had been blind to for so long. Real wealth was found in family, integrity, and love. As the rain poured down, Dorian turned and walked away, drenched and regretful, but with a newfound determination. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was one he had to walk alone. If this story moved you and offered unexpected twists, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful narratives that challenge the status quo and inspire change. Stay tuned for more stories of transformation and hard-earned lessons.